July 14, the 1584 Delft's main square seethes with a sea of bodies. Never before has the city seen such a crowd. Thousands squeezed together, breathless, desperate to witness the most savage spectacle the Low Countries have ever known. At the center of this human storm stands a 27-year-old man, shackled to a torture post. His feet are charred to the bone by red-hot irons. Strips of his skin have been torn away, one by one, with glowing pincers. Now, 4 horses stand tense, waiting for the moment they'll be whipped forward to rip his living body apart. His name is Balthazar Gerard, and just 10 days ago, he committed an act that would alter the fate of Europe. He murdered William of Orange, the founding father of the Dutch nation. But who was this young man, now the most reviled assassin in all the Netherlands? How could a devout Catholic extremist slip past the inner guard a national leader? And why did his execution turn into the most grotesque public ritual of 16th century Europe? To understand the roots of Balthazar Gerard's deadly conviction, we must turn back the pages to the bleak era of the Spanish Inquisition gripping the Low Countries. Balthazar entered the world in 1557 in the town of Voyafons in France, Conta region held firmly under Catholic Spanish rule. Raised in a fiercely devout household, he was taught that the Protestant Reformation wasn't merely wrong. It was a holy war, a spiritual cancer threatening the survival of true faith. From his earliest years, Balthazar was steeped in the teachings of the Jesuits, who filled his mind with visions of divine war. According to them, Dutch Protestants weren't just heretics, they were the devil's agents. Their defiance of King Philip II of Spain was rebellion not just against monarchy, but against God himself. To destroy them, he was taught, would not be sin, but salvation. In that fire of fanaticism, the mind of a future assassin was forged. Balthazar's obsession crystallized around one specific figure, William of Orange, known as William the Silent. This German nobleman had become the leader of the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, transforming himself into the supreme symbol of Protestant resistance. For Catholic fanatics, like Balthazar, William wasn't just a political rebel, he was the Antichrist incarnate, the destroyer of the true faith. In 1580, King Philip I placed a bounty of 25,000 gold escudos on William of Orange's head, a fortune that would make any man rich for life. More importantly, for fanatics like Balthazar, the king promised complete forgiveness of sins and hereditary nobility for whoever executed the Dutch heretic. It was a divine license to kill. For years, various assassins tried to collect the reward. In 1582, Georgi managed to seriously wound William with a pistol shot, but was killed by guards before completing his mission. The attack only increased the paranoia surrounding the Dutch leader and the determination of his enemies to eliminate him. Balthazar obsessively followed every assassination attempt. Each failure of others only fed his own homicidal ambition. He began meticulously planning his own mission, studying William's habits, the layouts of the palaces where he lived, the routines of his guards. His obsession consumed years of his life. In 1584, Balthazar finally put his plan into action. He assumed the false identity of François Guillaume, a French nobleman supposedly converted to Protestantism who wished to serve the Dutch cause. The performance was convincing. He had studied Protestant theology, memorized anti-Catholic arguments, and could debate religious doctrine with the fluency of a reformed pastor. The infiltration was a slow and careful process. Balthazar began by frequenting smaller Protestant circles, building a reputation as a sincere convert and fervent defender of Dutch independence. Gradually, he gained access to higher-ranking nobles, always presenting himself as François Guillaume, the French aristocrat who had abandoned everything to fight against Spanish tyranny. For months, Balthazar cultivated his false identity with the patience of a spider weaving its web. He participated in Protestant services, donated money to the rebel cause, and even wrote anti-Spanish pamphlets that circulated clandestinely. His apparent dedication to the Dutch cause was so convincing that no one suspected his true intentions. The breakthrough came when he secured an audience with one of William of Orange's close advisors. Balthazar claimed to have valuable information about Spanish military movements that could help in the defense of Delft. His story was verified through the contacts he had built over months, and all confirmed that Guillaume was a trustworthy Dutch patriot. In July 1584, Balthazar received what he had dreamed of for years, a private audience with William of Orange at the Boer Prinsenhof, the royal palace in Delft. The Dutch leader, always accessible to subjects who claimed to have important information, agreed to receive the supposed French nobleman. On July 10, 1584, William of Orange awakened in his palace in Delft, unaware that he was living his last day. At 51 years old, the father of the Dutch nation carried the weight of 16 years of brutal war against Spain. His graying temples and deep lines on his face testified to decades of fighting for the freedom of his adopted people. That morning, William was particularly concerned with reports that Spanish troops were concentrating near the border. Any information about enemy movements could be crucial for the defense of Dutch cities. When his advisors mentioned that François Guillaume, the French nobleman, had fresh information about Spanish activities, William immediately agreed to receive him. Balthazar arrived at the Prinsenhof in the middle of the afternoon, dressed modestly, but with the dignity appropriate to an aristocrat. He carried with him a small leather bag that he claimed contained maps and documents about Spanish military positions. In reality, the bag concealed 2 loaded wheel-lock pistols, the weapons he would use to fulfill his sacred mission. The initial meeting was cordial. I received Balthazar in his private study, an intimate environment where he usually discussed sensitive matters away from prying ears. The Dutch leader was accompanied only by a secretary and a guard, minimal security that reflected his confidence in his subjects' loyalty. For almost an hour, Balthazar perfectly played his role as François Guang. He discussed troop movements, military strategies, and even theological questions with William. The Dutch leader was impressed with the young Frenchman's knowledge and apparent dedication to the cause of independence. It was when William stood up to examine more closely a map that Balthazar had brought that the assassin saw his opportunity. While the Dutch leader had his back turned, leaning over the study table, Balthazar silently withdrew one of the pistols from his bag. "For the glory of God and the Catholic King," shouted Balthazar, firing point blank at William's back. The bullet pierced the Dutch leader's lung and heart, and he immediately collapsed onto the table, blood streaming from his mouth. Before anyone could react, Balthazar drew the second pistol and fired again, ensuring his victim was dead. The secretary and guard were paralyzed for a few crucial seconds, enough time for Balthazar to attempt escape, but his escape route had been poorly planned. The palace stairs were quickly blocked by guards, who rushed to the sound of gunshots. Cornered on the second floor of the Prinsenhof, Balthazar tried to jump from a window but fell badly and broke his leg. Balthazar's capture unleashed popular fury like the Netherlands had never witnessed. William of Orange wasn't just a political leader, he was the living symbol of the Dutch struggle for freedom, a man venerated as the father of the nation. His assassination was perceived not just as a crime, but as a national sacrilege. Enraged crowds surrounded the Prinsenhof, demanding immediate justice. Soldiers had to form a protective cordon around Balthazar to prevent him from being lynched on the spot. Cries of death to the Spanish assassin echoed through the streets of Delft as news of the crime spread like wildfire through the city. Balthazar's interrogation revealed the extent of his fanatical obsession. Under torture, he confessed his true identity, his years of planning, and his religious motivation for the assassination. Far from showing repentance, he proudly declared that he had fulfilled a sacred mission sent by God to destroy the enemy of the Catholic faith. The Dutch authorities decided that Balthazar's execution would be a public spectacle that would discourage future assassination attempts and satisfy the people's thirst for revenge. It wouldn't be a quick death. It would be an elaborate demonstration of justice that would last hours and include all the most refined tortures known to contemporary jurisprudence. July 14, 1584. The day of execution dawns clear and hot in Delft. From the early hours of dawn, people arrive from throughout the region to witness the death of William of Orange's assassin. Merchants close their shops. Artisans abandon their workshops. Peasants leave their fields. Everyone wants to see Balthazar Gerard pay for his crime. The main square has been transformed into a theater of horror. In the center, a wooden platform supports carefully organized torture instruments, glowing pincers, red-hot irons, ropes, and pulleys for quartering. 4 specially trained horses wait patiently, their harnesses connected to chains that will soon be tied to the condemned man's limbs. Balthazar is brought from prison in an open cart so that everyone can see the man who killed their national hero. Despite weeks of captivity and interrogation, he maintains a defiant expression. To the crowd's screams demanding his death, he responds with prayers in Latin and declarations that he will soon be in paradise as a martyr of the Catholic faith. The execution begins with the burning of his feet. Specialized executioners apply red-hot irons to the soles of Balthazar's feet, who screams in agony while the nauseating smell of burning flesh spreads through the square. But this is only the first stage of a death ritual that has been carefully planned to maximize both suffering and visual impact. Next, glowing pincers are used to tear away pieces of skin and flesh from Balthazar's arms, legs, and torso. Each application of the torture instrument draws screams that echo through the square, while the crowd watches with a mixture of morbid fascination and thirst for revenge. The young man who once dreamed of divine glory now experiences a very earthly hell. For hours, the torture continues with scientific precision. The executioners are artists in their macabre profession, knowing exactly how much suffering to inflict without causing premature death. Balthazar must remain conscious for the final phase of his execution, the quartering that will separate his limbs from his still living body. Finally, when Balthazar is reduced to a bloody mass of burned and mutilated flesh, but still breathing, comes the moment of the grand finale. Ropes are tied to his arms and legs, connected to the 4 horses that have been positioned in opposite directions. The crowd falls silent in morbid expectation. At the signal from the chief executioner, the horses are whipped simultaneously. The ropes tighten. Balthazar's limbs are pulled in opposite directions with increasing force. For several agonizing minutes, his body resists the tension, muscles and joints being stretched beyond any human limit. Then, with a nauseating sound that dozens of witnesses later described in letters and diaries, his arms and legs separate from his torso. Balthazar's mutilated torso still shows signs of life for a few terrible moments, blood gushing from where his limbs had been connected. Only when his heart finally stops beating does the crowd erupt in wild celebrations. Assassin is dead, and his death has been as brutal as his crime was cowardly. But Balthazar's death didn't end his story. In fact, it transformed it into a dark legend. His mortal remains were publicly displayed for weeks as a warning, but they also became, paradoxically, relics for Catholic fanatics who venerated him as a martyr. Pieces of his body were secretly collected by sympathizers who considered them sacred. William of Orange's assassination had profound political consequences that Balthazar could never have predicted. Far from destroying Dutch resistance, their leader's martyrdom strengthened it. William's son, Maurice of Nassau assumed leadership of the revolt with renewed determination, and the struggle for Dutch independence continued with even greater ferocity. Spain, which had sponsored the assassination through its reward and propaganda, discovered it had created a martyr more powerful dead than alive. The image of William of Orange as a national hero, assassinated by Catholic fanatics, became an enduring symbol of the struggle for religious and political freedom. Ironically, Balthazar achieved a perverse form of immortality through his crime. His brutal execution was documented by dozens of witnesses and became one of the most detailed descriptions of judicial torture in European historical literature. Artists created engravings of the event, and writers composed ballads about his death. His story spread throughout Europe as an example of the extremes to which religious fanaticism can lead. The story of Balthazar Gerard remains one of the most disturbing cases of religious terrorism in European history. An ordinary young man, radicalized by fanatical propaganda, managed to alter the course of history through an act of violence that cost 2 lives, that of his victim and, inevitably, his own. More than 400 years later, Balthazar's story continues to be relevant in an era when religious extremism still produces assassins willing to kill and die for their beliefs. His life and death illustrate how radical propaganda can transform ordinary people into instruments of violence, and how the thirst for revenge can lead entire societies to spectacles of cruelty that stain both victims and executioners alike. The traitor, who had his feet burned, his skin torn off, and was torn apart in the public square, achieved his place in history not as a hero or martyr, but as an eternal reminder of the dangers of limitless fanaticism and the terrible price that both assassins and their victims pay when religious hatred replaces common humanity.